this is going to be a unique session that is not seen in medical conferences too often. At least I don't know any other conference where we had this kind of debate. Has anybody seen it? So this debate, it is going to be about rising cost of cancer care. Who is responsible? As a cancer doctor, I see this every single day. Patients can't afford treatments. They can't afford doctor's visit. They can't afford hospitalization. They can't afford tests. Question is, what do we do about it? Should we allow patients to forego treatment and die? Or should we allow them to take medications or treatments and go bankrupt? So I think this is a time we must start talking about it and trying to fix the problem of rising cost of healthcare. So we have three moderators here who are going to moderate this debate. We have Dr. Scott Ramsey. So Scott Ramsey, he is a general internist, and he is nationally and internationally well-known person who has done a lot of research on outcomes. And he heads the Fred Hutchinson's Outcomes and so he co-chairs Outcomes and Comparative Effectiveness Committee of the Southwest Oncology Group. He's the past president of International Society of Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research. And he also heads the Fred Hutch Outcome Division. Scott, can you say hi to everybody turning around? Thank you. Then we have Michelle Millman. How many of, who does not know Michelle Millman in Seattle? So she is Anderson Cooper of Seattle.
No, I'm not.
So Michelle is news anchor for Cairo 7. She's a breast cancer survivor. And she's very, very passionate about cancer care. And so I am absolutely thrilled to have her. Thank you, Michelle, for being here. And then we have Dr. Thomas Brown. And I'm really thankful to Dr. Thomas Brown because, you know, we had Dr. John Pagel, who was supposed to moderate this meeting, this debate. And all of a sudden, he sent me an email, Vinay, I can't do this. I have something has come up. I'm like, listen, I need to find somebody to help me. He said, how about my boss? I'm like, of course, I would love that. So Thomas Brown heads Swedish Cancer Institute in Seattle. Thomas, can you say hi to everybody, please? So now I would like moderators to introduce debate panelists and start the debate.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Shaw. We'll get this underway. Thank you all for coming. First of all, let's start with the panelists. You can come up here and pick your podium, I guess. So no particular order here. Dr. Chadi Nabhan is Vice President and Chief Medical Officer at Cardinal Health Specialty Solutions. Welcome. Prior to joining Cardinal Health, Dr. Nabhan was at the Medical Center of the Clinical Cancer Center at the University of Chicago, where he oversaw the clinical operations of cancer clinics, supervising medical, surgical, and radiation oncology. Let's welcome him. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Congressman Adam Smith from the 9th District, welcome. Raised in SeaTac. His dad was a ramp serviceman at SeaTac Airport while he was growing up, and Adam went to Western, then transferred to Fordham, and then went to University of Washington's Law School, and he decided to run for state senate his final year at UW. Welcome here today, Congressman Smith. Don Hardison. Don Hardison is the CEO of Biotheranostics Incorporated, has more than 30 years of executive leadership experience in both emerging and Fortune 500 companies. He has extensive experience in diagnostic laboratory management, sales, marketing, strategy, and operations. Don Hardison. Gwen Nichols. Dr. Nichols is the Chief Medical Officer at Leukemia Lymphoma Society. Welcome. She trained in internal medicine at the University of Chicago and did her hematology oncology fellowship at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, where she served as Chief Fellow. Welcome, Dr. Nichols. Dr. Vinay Prasad is here. He's a hematologist oncologist and assistant professor of medicine at the Oregon Health Sciences University. He also holds appointments in the Division of Public Health and Preventative Medicine. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for welcoming everyone. Okay. So everyone here in the audience knows, and so our panelists knows, just a few things we need to tell you. We're dividing this into 3 segments this afternoon. You will each get 2 minutes to respond. There will be a bell when you have 20 seconds left, and then another bell when your time is up, when that 2 minutes is up. We'll let you finish your thought, of course, but then try to wrap it up if you could. And then after that, after these 3 segments, we'll go through with those 2 minutes each. We will take some questions from the audience. So audience, as this is going on this afternoon, you have paper and a pen, hopefully something to write on. If you have any questions, they write them out and they will get up here to us and we will try to ask those questions if we have time. So we are ready to begin. We have 3 different segments and Dr. Ramsey will start the first.
Thanks, Michelle. So just to follow up on what we just heard about the problem of cost in cancer care, we're going to start with the topic of cancer drug prices. So many of you know that cancer drugs have become extraordinarily expensive over the past few years. But the other side of the coin is that we are seeing drugs that are providing benefits to patients that have not been seen in the past. So an example, I was just speaking with a friend last night at dinner who has a friend who's on a lung cancer drug. The bill for that drug is $12,000 per month. We've also heard, perhaps some of you have heard about CAR-T drugs, which are the new breakthrough drugs for patients with formerly untreatable leukemias and lymphomas. Those drugs are transforming the lives of people who are being treated with them, but they come at price tags in the $375,000 to $475,000 range. So we're getting breakthroughs, but we're paying a very high price. And the first question we'd like to pose to you is, how do we deal with that problem of high price and high benefit? Are we getting what are we getting good value for the drugs that are coming, or do we have a problem with the pricing that we have right now for these drugs? And I'll stop there. We decided what we would do is just pick a new person for each question, just so everyone gets a chance to go first. So I thought we'd start with Don Hardison first.
Oh, the only person up here who's not with a drug company. That's great. I'm not prescribing either. So I'm on the diagnostic side of healthcare, and I was on therapeutics years ago. I've always been amazed that diagnostics is about 3% of the healthcare dollar, yet you can't get anything done until you get a test done. So I'm in a company today that has 2 products around cancer diagnosis. One of them is around breast cancer, and it actually is predictive of whether an aromatase inhibitor will work or not for a woman who's on breast cancer therapy that way. Yet we have a pretty hard time getting paid by either Medicare or some of the commercial payers and things like that. So when I hear about the cost of drugs at $200,000 or $300,000, the cost of our test to tell you if that drug's even going to work is about $3,000, $3,500. It seems like a bargain to me. And I go back to what Warren Buffett had up here is price is what you pay, value is what you get. To me, diagnostic tests are undervalued in what they can bring to the party here, with particularly in this high drug price environment we're in.
Great. Let's go next. I'm picking semi-randomly to Gwen Nichols.
So I think we throw the term value around quite a bit, and I think that it's very important, and as now head of a patient advocacy organization, to actually really consider what the patient considers valuable when we're making these equations, because it may not be exactly what scientists think is valuable. And The other half of the value equation goes back to exactly the question of diagnostics. A real value is not getting a drug that doesn't work, a high-cost drug that doesn't work. And if we aren't ready to use biomarkers and select patients appropriately, we aren't helping get the value, the true value of something like a CAR T that really can be a dramatic improvement for a patient. And so I think we need to focus more on selecting the right patients for the right treatment, and then the cost can be, and the value of it can be better assessed than having it be based on how much profit you might make from it, or the value equation based on how much it costs to produce.
So,
Please.
I mean, I'll take a more of a mathematical approach. No, first, I mean, I agree. We have to have a little bit more of all stakeholders in healthcare agree on the definition of value, and we oftentimes forget that the most important stakeholder is actually the patient. So patients have to be engaged, but mathematically, value is defined always as outcomes divided by cost. So first, we have to agree what are the outcomes that are most relevant to patients. And number two, when we talk about cost, is it really the cost of the drug, the cost of continuum of care from hospitalization to labs to survivorship and the additional testing that needs to be done. So these terms are not really uniformly agreed upon or defined to be able to figure out how you adjust. And I think, you know, as much as I hate to give any plug to economists, because I've always wanted to be an economist, I just didn't think I was smart enough. But I think healthcare economists need to be really engaged in figuring out how these formulas are done. I mean, there are some metrics that are being used, such as ICER. ASCO is attempting with the ASCO framework just an attempt to figure out how you look at benefits plus toxicity and palliation and cost and so forth. So these attempts are undergoing. It's not clear whether it will have direct impact on drug prices, because that's really what your question was, drug prices. I'm not sure if it will impact drug prices, but it will probably have an impact on the total cost of healthcare or the cancer care. Oops.
Saved by the bell. Dr. Prasad, what's your opinion on the value situation with cancer drugs today?
Yes, I'd say that I think I agree with Chadi's point that value is some ratio of the benefits a drug provides based on the cost and toxicity. I think you made the point that there are some drugs that are breakthrough drugs. They get disproportionate news coverage, but by no means are they the average drug. In an analysis by FOHO of 71 consecutive drugs approved for the solid tumors, the median improvement in survival was 2.1 months. So most of our drugs are incredibly marginal, offering benefits less than what patients deserve. Dr. Flowers is in the audience, and he has done some of the finest work in cost-effectiveness analysis on this topic, and I think he has found that some drugs like regorafenib cost upwards of $800,000 per quality-adjusted life year, which is a sum of money that no nation has ever been able to sustain or could afford. And some drugs like ramucirumab in second-line colon cancer, actually it's infinite because there are cheaper options that do the exact same job. On the CAR T issue, CAR T is certainly a good drug. I refer patients for CAR T, but the reality is that cost-effectiveness analyses on CAR T are very uncertain. We have very little follow-up data. There's a huge, I was a reviewer of the ICER report. It can change dramatically. We know from the Pen CAR T that no more than 45% of people who undergo that protocol will be in remission in 1 year, and the true number will be less than that as more data comes out. So that is not as much of a breakthrough as patients deserve. Finally, the cost of drugs can drop dramatically and not impact R&D, and that is the key. The continual argument made by the industry is we cannot lower the price of drugs because R&D spending needs to be so high, but we had a paper last year in JAMA Internal Medicine where we show that the industry's R&D spending is probably a third of what they've been saying it is. And about diagnostic tests, I would say that the downside there is they're not always validated to the degree that they ought to be for clinical use.
All right. We've got lots of things to talk about, I think, with, with that. Mr. Smith, maybe you could talk about what discussions are happening in Congress about this issue right now?
First of all, this is an unbelievably complicated topic to put 5 people up on a panel and say, explain it to us in 2 minutes. So there's going to be a limited value in that. But second of all, the problem, you can't just look at the cost of cancer drugs. Our healthcare system in this country is horrific, the way it is set up and the value it gets. We spend more than twice as much on healthcare as any other country in the world. And yet when it comes to outcomes, we consistently rank somewhere between 30 and 40 in the outcomes on everything. I don't know off the top of my head what the outcomes are in the various cancers that are out there, but I would imagine it's about the same. And there are very, very clear reasons for that, some of which have been brought up by my 4 fellow panelists here, that we refuse to address. And one of the biggest ones is the diagnostic issue. We misdiagnose, and also we're spending outside of what cancer drugs cost, and I understand these are incredibly sophisticated drugs that are going to cost a lot to make and will probably be very expensive. But number one, as this gentleman said, a lot of them really don't make that much difference, and yet we spend an enormous amount of money on them. Why? Because the companies are able to do that, because nobody's really regulating it and keeping control of that. And I'm sorry, doing this in 2 minutes is like virtually impossible. But look, our healthcare system, number one, everybody has to be covered. If everybody isn't covered, if everybody isn't paying into the system, the inefficiencies that come from that drive costs through the ceiling. I could explain that in greater detail, but not in 40 seconds. Number two, we place very, very little emphasis on actually doing a correct diagnosis. Everything is stovepiped within the healthcare system. And I've been through like 4 major surgeries in the last 5 years. Not very good outcomes. And the primary problem was nobody took the time up front to really analyze what the problem was and then figure it out from there and measure the outcomes. The last thing I will say on this piece, and I'll try to say more about it later, is we have no cost control in our healthcare system. Cost control is just basically whatever you can lobby most sophisticatedly to get CMS to pay for you. I heard you the first time. And so we don't have anyone saying, look, we shouldn't be paying for this. And I'll give you my favorite example from the healthcare debate in 2010. And of course, it does not help that the Affordable Care Act has effectively been repealed and replaced with nothing. We're just sort of letting it run wild. But we do 5 times as many MRIs in the United States as they do in Germany. But on the things that MRIs are supposed to detect and treat, our outcomes are worse. Why? Because we pay for quantity, not for quality. That is the number one biggest thing that we have to change, is all the providers, all the people that are being paid, instead of paying them for doing stuff that may or may not work, pay them for actually giving us outcomes. That's what we don't do in this country, and until you fix that, whether it's cancer or osteopath, whatever it is, we are going to be spending an enormous amount of money for suboptimal results.
Thank you.
That's a perfect segue to Dr. Brown's question.
Probably each of you is aware there has been a recent presentation and publication by Beckelman and Jaffe based on a consensus approach. I suspect that Dr. Prasad is aware of this, this effort to identify 3 steps toward a more sustainable path for targeted cancer therapies, which are, of course, some of the most expensive therapies, as has already been alluded to. And the 3 steps that were recommended, first, that the FDA define minimally clinically meaningful effective effect sizes in the realm of, say, 3 to 6 months of an improvement in survival, overall survival, compared to the standard therapy in that given area. The second was that CMS should be given authority to negotiate drug prices. And the third was that guidelines, such as the NCCN guidelines, prioritize drugs based on benefit, on minimally significant clinical benefit, as well as price. So I'd like each of you to comment on any one of those. And actually, I'd like to reverse the order and ask Congressman Smith to especially comment on the likelihood, when this was discussed in Chicago last week, it was felt that the change in role for CMS, or allowing CMS to negotiate drug prices would be an impossibility. But the emphasis was placed, obviously, on the driver that is Medicare when it comes to drug cost. Would you like to comment?
Sure, and it's kind of what I already said, but there was one of the things that the ACA set up was an organization, it'd be helpful if I could remember their name, but their task was basically to figure out what the most cost-effective treatment was, and basically decide what they're going to pay for and what they're not going to pay for. Ever since that was put in the ACA, Congress has systematically been trying to kill it, because everybody wants the treatment they want when they want it, and they don't want somebody out there saying that they're not going to be able to get it. And the consequence of that, of course, is we wind up paying for an enormous amount of stuff that isn't altogether that helpful. One thing would also be helpful would be if CMS could better negotiate for drug prices. And I think that's important, but I think the broader point of setting up a healthcare system that pays for the quality of outcomes and not for the quantity is vastly more important. That's what drives us into paying for drugs, and I think you outlined it perfectly. We pay this enormous amount of money for a drug that really doesn't make that much difference. We have got to get greater control of that. We have lost the balance in our healthcare system between incentivizing the private sector to go out and develop the new technologies and the new drugs. And yes, there are many that have been developed that haven't worked as well as advertised, but there's also a lot that have worked really, really well and that have made an enormous difference in people's lives. So we want those incentives in place. But you also need proper regulations, whether it's CMS being able to negotiate drug prices or being able to say, look, we're not going to pay for that because it's not cost effective. But people don't want that, and it's very understandable why people don't want that, because you can look at the population as a whole and you could say, all right, 99.99999% of the time, this is the right choice. But if you're that one person in that one little piece there, you want what you want when you want it. And if we've got a healthcare system and you happen to have insurance that'll pay for it, you're going to get it. We've got to start making those top-level decisions about what the most effective treatment is and pay for that.
So do you think that having CMS take on a negotiating role regarding drug prices, is that a politically viable idea? I understand that you've expressed a willingness to consider that, but is it politically viable in the current environment?
Well, if you start talking about politically viable, that gets me into a much longer rant about the current dysfunction of our entire political system. And all I will say about that...
That is another debate, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's tied directly into this, because all the things that we're talking about doing require a government that can implement them. Now, I want you to know that it's not just the elected representatives in Congress that are dysfunctional. It's the people who elect us, because that's the way it works. I have a long rant on this, which I don't have time for. But until we start being more willing to look at tough choices and have an honest debate. Look, our politics for 30 to 35 years now has been based on dishonesty. Donald Trump was just honest enough to look you in the face and not even pretend that it wasn't. So we've got to get past that, and the budget and healthcare policy are the two biggest areas where that dishonesty is overwhelming.
Well, thank you, Congressman. Dr. Prasad, would you like to comment on any one of those three recommended steps? I'm sure you're familiar with that publication.
Yeah, so this is a nice paper by Justin Beckelman and Steve Joffe in JAMA a week or two ago. And there were three things. So one was the minimum effect size. So we have an FDA that unfortunately has set the bar for cancer drugs so low we could trip over it. In fact, I wish it were 3 months, what were the drugs we were getting, but we have drugs that are approved with a median improvement in survival of 10 days. We have drugs that improve a surrogate endpoint, which is not a measure of how patients feel or function, by about 1.5% to 2% in breast cancer.
I'm sorry, it's very important. Why do you think the FDA does that?
Why do I think the FDA does that? That's a good question. So I think that the FDA is in one of these situations where they're under intense political pressure to lower the bar to approve drug products for the benefit of the people who make the drug products. And the majority of Americans do not have the interest in this topic to push back against the small interest of people with a strong financial incentive in making this the political system.
Right, and I think in fairness, the perception that a drug, no matter how marginal it may be, will be of significant help to someone at some point. And again, you and I know the issues with that. But.
And I think that is a talking point put forth by the pharmaceutical industry, who have heavily lobbied and perhaps even written some of these bills that guide the FDA. I think if you work at the FDA and you lay down the law and set reasonable standards, you may not last long in the FDA. You will certainly not last long in the FDA in this political climate. But the pendulum will swing on this issue because the FDA's approval process has violated, I think, at point times even their own stated standards, and the bar is too low, and I think too many people are starting to comment about this. I've been one vocal voice on this. There are people globally who are increasingly commenting. I think patients do not want drugs that put 40% of them with grade 3 diarrhea and give them a 1% improvement in a surrogate endpoint. They want better drugs. And if you can give a company billions of dollars in profit from a drug that's very marginal, there is no financial incentive to make a really great drug. And that doesn't really exist in the system.
So you're strongly in favor of raising the bar is the bottom line.
And the other 2 points real quick, CMS negotiation, I think he's strongly in favor, and I think it will happen. It is irrational to not have the largest payer in the system and be able to negotiate the price. And the NCCN guidelines are a very poor way to make coverage decisions. We had a paper in BMJ in the last month showing that when the NCCN extrapolates beyond the FDA, it's almost always based on very low levels of evidence, and the majority of people on that guidelines committee are unfortunately conflicted financially with the manufacturer of some of these products. So I think it's a bad system.
One example was given in the papers, you know, of bone metabolism drugs, and they're all perceived as equally effective, while the price, the cost of those drugs ranges wildly.
But I think, if I may...
Dr. Nabhan, yes, you were next.
I get 20 seconds, right?
2 minutes.
According to the rules.
Please.
I'll do my best. I struggle with the fact that we have to make this binary decision of 3 months. If you do over 3 months, it's okay. If less than 3 months, no. Or 6 months, or whatever arbitrary time point that we actually choose. I think that's a little bit challenging, and it would be very difficult if you look historically. And I'm not a GI oncologist, but you know, the first improvement in colorectal cancer was maybe about 8 weeks, and then subsequently 12 weeks and so forth. And eventually patients with colorectal cancer with stage 4 have a median survival that approaches a little bit less than 3 years. But that was incremental improvement. Now what I would concede though, that it's instead of just saying it's going to be 3 months or 4 months or 5 months, is to add additional points that are relevant to patients. So yes, if it's actually 2 months improvement in overall survival, but it substantially reduces the pain of patients, it reduces hospitalization at the end of life, it actually provides actual measures of quality of life, then we will look at this. But if you're just going to toss out a drug just because it did not meet this arbitrarily chosen point, I think it's really problematic. And I would actually concede that this is an issue.
Dr. Nabhan, let me clarify. Do you agree with the premise that the current bar is set too low, though?
Oh, no, I do agree with that. But I'm just saying that, you know, we'll have to, we just can't pick a bar. I mean, 3 months to me might be low, might be high to somebody else, and I think we just have to...
quibble with the 3 months, but we should
Yes.
point out 2/3 of the approved cancer drugs, we can't even say the number of months because we do not even have data on this topic. We do not even know. So I think there's a lot way to improve before we put these arbitrary bars.
Dr. Nichols, do you have any comments?
So I think that point is well taken, and I think the practitioner has the very difficult problem of trying to provide hope for a patient who wants to try something. And so what you need is to have a conversation with the patient where you have the data to be able to say what the likelihood is of that drug giving you a benefit, and also what the cost is going to be. And I can tell you, as you know, fortunately I am not practicing anymore, but when I was, to be able to say what the actual cost was going to be, given the 20 different types of insurance people in New York might have, and the different amount of copay for a different drug or so forth, you could never have a cost-benefit discussion with a patient because you don't have the data, you don't know the biomarker that tells you whether this patient is the one that's going to have the 3 years of benefit versus 1 year of benefit, and you have no idea what the actual out-of-pocket cost is going to be for the patient. And so I think if we want to have those discussions, we really need to have a much more comprehensive understanding of what actual costs are so that the practitioner and the patient can have that discussion. And we don't have that now.
And do you also agree that the current bar is set too low?
I don't think the bar is set too low. I think the criteria that we're using are misguided. So I think we need to think about the patient's benefit and understand what that really is, if it's pain relief, if it's life extension, if it is quality of life, and then what it will cost them to get that so that they themselves can make that decision with their doctor.
Those might be one and the same, though, the bar being set too low and the wrong criteria being used. Mr. Hardison, what is coming up repeatedly is the mention of biomarkers, and obviously part of setting the bar is, in some cases, requiring biomarker identification. Your comments, your thoughts?
Well, I'm afraid now after listening to these guys talk about the drug part of this, because some of this I did not know. But I will tell you that the biomarker, I think the only way you're ever going to control this high cost or help control this high cost is to know if a drug's going to work or not up front. And if I was a patient, the older I get, the more I worry about it. It's actually more than 30 years, so I'm really getting up there. And I would like to know when a doctor prescribes a drug for me that it's going to work. And I think most Americans just take it for granted that it's going to work because a doctor prescribed it for them. NCCN is an example, in the diagnostic side of it is actually reasonably helpful for us, because without them putting something into guidelines, you can't get a commercial payer to pay you to save your life. They will always fall back and I'm not going to pay you because you're not in the guidelines. So I don't know if the bars are too low and things. I don't know enough about the inner workings of these organizations. I just know that you need to have somebody who's opining on the value of the diagnostics. In my case, have we done enough studies? Do we have clinical utility? And we think we do a lot of studies, but we need somebody else to opine on that.
Thank you. There's one other piece of this. There is a lot of research going into figuring out how a specific drug will impact a specific patient. And there's a company actually here in Seattle that can do that can go in and take a sample from your liver and tell you in advance with a lot of drugs how is this going to impact you. CMS won't pay for that service until the drugs aren't working. So instead of upfront saying, okay, here's the diagnosis we think we have for you, we have this menu of drugs, let's go in and see what might work for you, we're going to basically use you as a that's the word I'm looking for. Yes, guinea pig. Pump a bunch of drugs into you, screw you up 15 different ways, and then go, oh, well, that didn't work. Let's find out why. We should sort of invert that. And there's actually quite a bit of research being done right now. The Institute for Systems Biology with Leroy Hood and others, they're trying to figure that out, because this was shocking to me as I have chronic pain. And as I was trying to deal with that and not touch an opioid, which I managed to do, they throw a whole bunch of other stuff at you. It's like, here, try this, try that. It's like, yeah, it'll be fine. No, actually it won't. We can figure this stuff out, but it's not where the money's spent. The money is spent, as this gentleman points out, the drug companies being able to sell drugs, make an enormous amount of money. Spend it on figuring out, number one, get the diagnosis right, and number two, get the treatment right for that particular patient. We could drive that policy. The healthcare profession could drive that policy, but the incentives aren't there. And we need to, or we're going to continue to waste an enormous amount of money making people worse instead of better.
Congressman Smith, goes right into our next segment we have here. Is the heart of all this is the patient. How can we help the patient? The cost of health care. Vinay, Dr. Shah said in the beginning when he introduced this debate that some people have to make that choice. Do I pay the bills or get this cancer drug? Do I go in for treatment or feed my kids? That's an extreme example. But in each of your professions, how do you think we could better take care of the patient so they're not going into debt over this, or some of the examples the Congressman gave? And we can start here.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously the most difficult question to answer, because the heart of the matter is obviously always the patient. I'm going to say that the first step is really educating the patient, because there are times where patients might demand a particular therapy or a particular treatment based on maybe what's written in the media or in the newspaper or a TV show without understanding the true benefit of this particular therapy. So there is really a culture here that if I want this treatment or if I want this test, then I should be able to get this treatment, I should be able to get this test. And if I don't deliver this as an oncologist, I'm not quote unquote aggressive enough. There's, I'm going to go and see that, he's really aggressive in treating cancer. And really the definition of being aggressive is that you're willing to continue therapy, whether it's going to help or not. So I do think that part is really critical, because sometimes patients may not require this therapy. I think the most challenging aspect of your question is if the patient truly require that treatment, and that treatment is unaffordable, what to do. And I think short of trying to reach to charity organizations and other organizations, I think Dr. Nichols is here. I'm sure that her organization has helped a lot of patients throughout the years. I don't really see an easy way out, because certainly there are drugs that do help, but they are expensive and patients aren't able to afford. And these are the ones that are very difficult for an oncologist to navigate. So reaching out to charity organization is, I think, the way to do, and philanthropic funds and charity for, many hospitals are non-for-profit, and part of the non-for-profit mission is to provide charity care to patients.
So I want to follow up on that comment, because it relates to some work we've done at the Fred Hutch looking at what the term is now, financial toxicity, and how it's affecting patients. Our own group doing studies here in Washington State looking at cancer patients have shown that between 30 and 40% of cancer patients report severe financial distress, defined as having to remortgage their house, use up all their savings, borrow money from friends, or going bankrupt. So I don't think that the problem of patients, given the prevalence of that problem, I don't think charities are going to be the solution for our country in terms of helping this. And other studies have replicated our work around the country and have found similar rates, and you can find many, many articles on this now.
And Scott, just to one of your other observations, was it not that that's associated with poorer outcomes, to include mortality, higher mortality rates?
We did a study showing that patients who go bankrupt, which is the most extreme form of financial distress, we were talking about cancer patients, have a 67% worse survival than those who do not go bankrupt, who are the same type of cancer patient. So that type of financial distress is a mortal event for many cancer patients. So given the prevalence of the problem, the fact that it's affecting patient outcomes, what should we be doing? What conversation should we be having in this country about fixing that problem?
I wish I could speak on it globally, but I would be out of my league. I can only tell you how I've thought about it since I've been running healthcare companies. We try not to turn any patient away. And we start with breast cancer tests, for example, we try to find out if the patient has insurance. If they don't, if they do have insurance, we want to find out what their copay is and help them through it, because most people don't understand copays or deductibles, and they don't know what they've got at any time. And beyond that, though, we try to find some way to get everybody tested. We don't turn anybody away, so we have a way in the end to almost get anybody tested if they need it. Now, they have to be educated to it, and a lot of them, to your good points, they're going through so many other things about the therapy and all the other things associated with cancer. The fact they've got to pay us $300 more on a test blows their mind. But it's so small compared to everything else they've already paid. It's just a tough situation to be in. So from my point of view, as companies like ours, we have to be able to you have to be able to make money along the way, but you've got to spread the risk across a lot of different patients. It's the only way we know how to stay in business and to keep innovating on new things. Because you're not going to get any innovation unless people make some money on it. It just doesn't work that way.
I want to ask Dr. Nichols, because you probably hear this from your constituents.
Yeah, so LLS has an 800 number where we provide free support for patients, and that includes educational support, emotional support, finding peers, and financial support in a variety of different ways. And the escalation of how that service is now used, that the most frequent call is not, I need information about my lymphoma or leukemia. It is, I don't know how I can afford my treatment. Tells you that the whole system is bankrupt, and we are just putting our fingers in the dike to try and help these patients. And the need is so great, and I wish we've been talking about the cost of drugs. That's just one piece of the puzzle. There are, I talked to a patient, and we were in Washington meeting with Congress people, because this is a 27-year-old who was no longer on his parents' policy, and so bought a junk plan, and 6 months, at 5.5 months in, was diagnosed with leukemia. He is now 27 and a half and $800,000 in debt because they wouldn't renew because he had a pre-existing condition. He may be cured of his leukemia, but he's starting his life in an impossible place. And this is not an unusual story. This is a story we hear every day. And so it is the system writ large that we need to change, not just one piece.
So I guess I would just take two sides to this. I mean, some of us on this panel still wear two hats, as a doctor and then as somebody who studies the policy. As a doctor, I think, fortunately in this country, that despite all of the difficulties, I feel as if I'm always able to provide the best medical care for the patients I see, irrespective of insurance status and ability to pay, because we, through force of will, find a way to get things paid for. And I would say, but when I say best care, I don't mean most care or always newest care or shiniest care. I mean best care, which often can be some older things. So in this space of cancer, we really have to separate the hype, of which there is many, many hype products, from what is actually best for the patient, which requires, I think, lots of study of the science behind cancer medicine. Now, how to fix this from a broader societal level is, I think, there is clearly profiteering in this space. There's massive profiteering in the healthcare space, both from the industry side as well as from the so-called nonprofit entities in this space who are having hefty and generous nonprofits year after year. And I think insofar as regulation can bend that profiteering out of the system, it should do so, but at the end of the day, you'll still be left with a bill. And the solution to that is simply to have people with more pay tax so that people with less can have access to this health care. And that's a simple solution that, unfortunately, there's not much political will to put into place.
You're reminding me that there's that old saw in training young physicians, that sometimes what one doesn't do is as important as what one does. That's true in a biological sense, but it's also true in a financial toxicity context. There was a question from the audience.
If I could.
Yes, please, Congressman.
First of all, of course, the problem is you don't get paid for what you don't do. And that creates a perverse incentive within the system. And I agree with 99% of what you said. I don't agree on the issue. There are people in this country who do not get the best care because of a cost problem. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. There are certainly examples of providers that go out of their way to make sure that doesn't happen. But the fact that there are people in the situation you described.
I said my patients, I feel
I know, you take care of it. But the system writ large.
Yeah.
So just 3 quick points. One, I'll go back to it, universal access. The fact that everybody is not covered is an enormous problem, and the idiocy of the debate over this drives me crazy. What was said about the Affordable Care Act? Well, we shouldn't mandate that people have insurance. That's forcing it. It doesn't work if you don't mandate that everybody has insurance, all right? Because healthier people, insurance companies will cherry pick healthy populations. Healthy people will decide not to pay, and then they'll wake up one day and they'll be unhealthy. If you don't cover everybody, you are pushing a boulder up a hill that is way, way too steep. So we got to cover everybody. There's a dozen different ways to do it. It doesn't have to be single payer. France, Germany, all these countries, they don't have single payer, but they do have universal access. And until we get universal access, we're going to be having this painful conversation. Number 2, cost control, which I've already talked a lot about. We spend, 17, 18% of GDP right now on healthcare. We have got to get aggressive about cost control, and you're going to have to bash on a lot of people to get there. Because there's, when you say we spend 17 to 18% of GDP on healthcare, and you go, that's a terrible thing, it ain't a terrible thing if you're in the healthcare profession, okay? If you're a provider, you're kind of fond of it. Lastly, on the patient thing, yeah, the patients do to some degree have to take responsibility for their health care, but it's up to the provider. And I can tell you, I didn't have cancer, but I was in, like I said, a terrible, terrible situation. You go see a provider, he or she is God in that situation. You know, and if she tells you, look, here's the operation, here's the pill, you do this, we're going to fix you. You know, you're not going to go back and look on the internet and say, oh, this isn't true. You're going to say, thank you, do it, let me be done with this. The providers have really got to take responsibility for not giving their patients the wrong care.
There was a question from the audience that I think will be a nice segue from the responses that each of you have given. And the question is basically, can each of you explain why the constituents that you represent, or the profession or role that you represent, are partly at fault for the rise in cancer care cost? So trying to flip things around a little bit, and I thank the person who submitted this question.
My constituents are perfect, and they are to blame for nothing. I just want that on the record.
Well, let's talk about your political colleagues.
I was kidding, by the way. That's that first point. But no, look, they're a huge part of the problem. I mean, why didn't we have the individual mandate? Because, you know, I'd sit there, well, look, this is the politics of promising something for nothing. And like I said, I got about a 20-minute speech on this, but I won't get into it. You promise something for nothing because that's what the people want, okay? When you're, you know, 3-4 weeks out in a 50-50 race and you got maybe 4% undecided, you're not going to go up to them and say, look, here's where you're wrong about something. You're going to tell them what they want to hear. And what do they want to hear? They want to hear that you're going to give them health care and it's not going to cost them much. They want to hear you're going to give them tax cuts and it's not going to create a deficit. They want to hear that you're going to spend more money on their favorite programs and it's not going to cause a deficit. We're not having that honest conversation. And so the political system and the consultants and the pollsters are largely, we've gotten way too good at figuring out what all of you want, okay? And then promising it to. I mean, the Cambridge Analytica thing, tip of the iceberg. So that's the fault of the political system. But the people don't have to buy that crap, all right? They ought to know better. They ought to know if something is being promised to them that's too good to be true. If Donald Trump stands up there and says, I'm going to get rid of the individual mandate, I'm going to keep the pre-existing condition coverage, it's all going to be great, it's going to be beautiful, it's going to be perfect, you ought to know that that's, bullshit, okay? And buying into that is really where the public, they got to be more rigorous and saying, no, look, I wish that were true, it's not, we need a more honest answer. And healthcare is one of the biggest areas where we don't have those honest answers.
Dr. Nichols, how do physicians, do providers contribute to the problem?
Well, I think that your excitement and your wanting to do something for a patient can get in the way of rational thought about what actually is reasonable to do for the patient. And it's harder to have the conversation about, no, I'm not giving you the new shiny new thing, I'm giving you something we've had for 20 years. And there are a lot of disincentives to that. I still think that there is a need for better understanding amongst practitioners about what the actual out-of-pocket cost is going to be for their patient for any given intervention.
The data.
And they are not working with that information on the most part. And so it is a sick person who says, I saw this on the internet, please, and it's a very tough position. If you were able to have the data to be able to say, this is $100,000 out of pocket for you next year, and it's going to give you this much benefit compared with something that is generic and is going to give you the same amount of benefit. People would say, yeah, I don't want to wreck my kid's chance of going to college. I'll take, what you prescribe. But without the understanding of what the actual cost is going to be, the easy solution is to say, sure, I'll give you the shiny new thing. Yeah.
People ask me uncomfortable questions all the time. I rarely get the opportunity. Within the healthcare profession, and I get all of that, but how much of it is also driven by whatever type of provider you are, and we've bashed on drug companies a little bit here, but look at what happened at Swedish Hospital just recently with neurosurgery. When it found out that they were cranking through neurosurgeries, like, I don't know, I don't have an analogy, but way too fast, and it was because of the money. And I love Swedish Hospital. Both my children were born there. They did a great job. They're fabulous people. But how many times within the provider community do you order that surgery? Do you order that test? Because you know what the bottom line is of the hospital and of the providers. Does that influence decisions?
I think it influences decisions. I think that there's a structure that rewards that instead of quality. And so it's a quality and value question. And if you're not going to be employed, you're going to have a hard time not doing 3 more surgeries. And that is, it is clearly a problem.
Dr. Prasad.
I would just, I think these are all excellent points. I would just add, for my constituency, which is, I guess, oncologists who see patients, I think there are a few categories that we are complicit in this. One, we're undereducated on how to interpret medical evidence, and so we are easily or often fooled by drug company promotions or by, I think, sort of simple explanations of the medical evidence, and it really requires a skill set that is not adequately taught in medical education. We, or perhaps even some of the leading centers, are complicit in the hype pipeline that pervades cancer medicine that I think further encourages false ideas about what is new. We have this human bias that it's better to act than not to act. This is the bias of commission. We have conflicts, both the financial conflict from how we're paid for doing more, which has been alluded to, and the conflict that many oncologists are conflicted with drug makers, particularly the experts who are guiding the rest of us in their chosen fields. They have higher than average conflict rates. I think doctors are probably guilty of thinking that because they're doctors, they know everything about policy as well, and I think that that's probably not the case. We're novices in policy, and we don't know what the costs affect our patients.
Did you hear that, Congressman?
Yeah, I think we are novices. There's a lot to know.
Doctors are afraid to come talk to me, by the way.
But I think we want to reform. I would say that I think there is a professional buy-in. There are increasing calls from broad groups of oncologists that these issues are getting out of control. We want to do better, and I think we're increasingly providing for them. So I think there's hope for us.
Dr. Nabhan, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think Vinay mentioned a couple of things I was gonna say, but I just, for a busy oncologist, just picture a scenario of, again, the clinic is very busy, right? I mean, you're supposed to see 25 patients. And these are complex patients with variety of oncologic malignancies, and then you see this patient who has failed 3 lines of lung cancer, stage 4 lung cancer, and there's no evidence maybe in this particular patient that a 4th line therapy is going to help, and you don't have a clinical trial, which is really easier for you as an oncologist to say, I'm going to prescribe this 4th line therapy and just go talk to my nurse and learn about the side effects, and you move on to the next patient, or spend about an hour to discuss end-of-life issues and the fact that you're going to refer to palliative care and hospice. The reality is it's much harder to do the latter. And these difficult conversations are, again, physicians are not incentivized to do it because there are a lot of these, again, you don't get rewarded for what you don't do. And I'll say one last thing is also from a conflicting standpoint, hospitals, there's a lot of pressure on the numbers. And I think the example that the congressman mentioned about what happened at Swedish Hospital is simply the pressure on the numbers. You just have to show your board the numbers and the revenue. And if you don't, you get a phone call, what's going on? If you work in a cancer center and the volume of the cancer center is down, the head of the cancer center gets a call either from the dean or the CEO, is something going on there? Are we upsetting our referrals and so forth? Because the pressure is always on to deliver.
Well, I appreciate those comments. The original question from the audience, though, was how your constituency contributes to the cost.
So are you saying I wasn't successful in pivoting this?
How?
All right.
You were not.
All right, that's good. So you're paying attention to what I said. I'll answer in 30 seconds.
How does the pharmacy benefit realm
I'll answer in 30
to the challenge?
Sure, I'll answer in 30 seconds. So we sit in the middle between manufacturers and providers, at least in my current role. And what I would say, one of the things that I'm often challenged to do, and hopefully I try to do it to the best of my ability, is try to help manufacturers demonstrate value, if the value exists for these products, that beyond the response rates, beyond the PFS, beyond overall survival. there's a lot of this, there's value-based care from volume-based care. So what type of value you need to demonstrate? Let's look at comparative effectiveness. Let's look at the overall disease burden that you are in that space for. How often patients go to the emergency room, to the hospital, and can we really, what do you bring beyond this usual metrics, PFSOS? From a provider perspective, is trying to look at quality metrics, at the ability to implement measures and care coordination that hopefully reduce hospitalization, but most importantly also end-of-life care. And I think there's a lot of stats out there that whatever cancer you look at, the spending in the last several weeks of life oftentimes surpasses the spending in the first couple of years from the diagnosis. Any cancer you pick, you see that. So there's a lot of opportunities there to work with providers.
So you feel that Cardinal and similar organizations can play a more active role in the steps that you just reviewed?
Absolutely, and hopefully we are.
We're complicit. I'll tell you how. So the world I live in, not all innovations come from small companies in healthcare, but a lot of them do. In diagnostics, a lot of them do. Most of them are VC funded. The margins in our business are nothing like a pharma business. It's not even in the realm of it. It's not even close. And what happens sometimes, I think over the years, people have taken shortcuts on diagnostic tests, doing the work they should have done. I'll give you a quick example. So if you see Cologuard ads on TV from Exact Sciences, that was the company I ran for a long time. We used to get, and this goes to what somebody said earlier, doctors are terrifically, or not so good at interpreting medical data. I'd get a call from an investor, he would say, or she would say, we just heard about a blood test that has 90% sensitivity compared to yours, and you have a stool-based test. Why would anybody want to get anything but a blood-based test? And I'd say, well, where'd you see the study? So you go back and look at the study, and the study was done with a fecal occult blood test, which is not totally worthless, but it's close enough. And they would test people if they were bleeding, they'd get a colonoscopy, and that was how they interpreted sensitivity. Exact Sciences at that time, we gave everybody a colonoscopy, everybody got our test, everybody got a fecal occult blood test, they were blinded to the results. That's the only way to do a good study. And we spent $20 million. For a drug company, that's a rounding error. For a startup diagnostic company, trust me, it's not a rounding error. To even get $8 or $10 million from a round of venture capital is a lot of money. So what happens sometimes is people do take shortcuts in our business, have over the years, and a lot of people who have done a really good job and put out really good work, they do get an NCCN guidelines. That's why we need somebody to referee on our behalf to get us into the darn guidelines so we can get paid. How's that for complicity?
Thank you.
Another question from the audience, maybe piggybacks on what Dr. Prasad was saying about the HYPE campaign. So a question from the room here, can we stop pharma companies from advertising direct to consumer via TV and media ads? How is this even legal? That was my input there. Yeah, Congressman, we'll start here and go down.
The law was changed, I forget, I don't think it was by Congress, I think it was a regulation change in the 90s. And yeah, no, it's terrible. And I can only think of providers, if people show up, they say they saw it on. Of course, in this day and age, though, I mean, people don't get their information from television. Yeah. I mean, you can ban television ads all you want, and all you have to do is go on the internet, and you can't stop people from going on the internet and saying, hey, I got this great new drug. So how you put that genie back in the bottle, I don't know. But yes, you've got a lot of very uninformed people getting this information, being persuaded, and it happened even before television ads. If you read the history of opiates, and I forget the name of the truly evil drug company that started the whole opiate thing.
Purdue Pharma?
Purdue.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, back in the 60s, they were pushing Valium, to freshmen in college if they were like stressed out, and they weren't advertising on television. They were figuring out ways to get into that network. So yeah, it'd be better if the information was controlled by the experts. In the information age, I leave it to you to tell me how we could do that.
Yeah, I mean,
Can I ask you? Go ahead, Vinay.
I was going to say, I mean, I think direct-to-consumer advertising is problematic. We're only one of 2 nations that allows it. There'd been even a randomized study in JAMA many years ago where they actually had a standardized patient. A patient, they kind of was an actor, would go in the office and say, I saw this ad on TV, and they showed that that patient was more likely to get a prescription antidepressant, even when they didn't meet clinical guidelines for meeting that disorder. I think that the advertisement is just the tip of the iceberg. We had a paper last year where we found a general hospital storyline for a rare disease was actually, in collaboration with Insight Pharmaceuticals, who makes a very costly drug in that space, and we wrote about that in JAMA. So I think it's very problematic. I think that we have to weigh the freedom of speech of corporations against the freedom of the public to be able to have sort of impartial information in a space that requires a great deal of expertise to sort it out. And so I think that regulation does need to take place, and it should be extended to social media and all the newer forms of communication.
I'll pose a question maybe to my fellow panelists as well as the audience. I mean, how is this, not saying right or wrong, I'll take a neutral position here, but how is this different than any of academic institution or hospital in the region advertising on TV? How is that different than, hospital X saying, come to us, we have the best MRI machine, the best robotic surgery?
It's not different, and they also need to be regulated on this
But
issue. They put out terrible ads.
Right,
Yeah,
and the
yeah.
reason I say that is because I think we disproportionately sometimes say, well, this is bad, but it's okay. And I think we really, switch on TV, says this is the best place for spinal surgery. This is the best way. We have the new machine and so forth. So I think it's either as a society we say any type of direct-to-consumer advertising from any healthcare entity is something that we would like to ban. It's not allowed, or we have to say that it's allowed. But I don't think it's fair to say that this type of healthcare entities are not allowed to advertise, but the other ones
But perhaps
are allowed.
not banned, but regulated in a way that it is not extremely misleading, that provides some balance of the risks and benefits and what has actually been shown and what is merely rhetoric, I think would be more reasonable. But I agree with him that it is not, you can't just pick on the pharmaceutical industry. You have to look broadly at this problem.
Wasn't the point that you're bringing up really about the dynamic of increasingly, at least in some quarters, relegating the governmental role in healthcare at whatever level to the private sector? I mean, isn't this part of the dynamic you're talking about? We're reluctant to see medicine in the same free market context that we see commodities of other sorts.
Yeah, obviously because there are patient lives at stake, so it's just very different here and so forth. All I'm saying is it's okay to attempt to regulate direct-to-consumer advertising if this is something that is viewed by policymakers as well as patients and physicians that is not appropriate, but I will continue to contest that if you do so, you can't just do it only for a particular sector versus another, and you have to say, yes, you got the best MRI and robotic device, but you can't advertise about it on the 10 o'clock news.
Well, not only is there increasing direct-to-consumer advertising, there's obviously increasing direct-to-consumer service, which is an extension of that.
I'd argue that if those costs saved were put back to the patient, there would be, a substantial savings. But it would have to be broadly done. It can't just be for agents.
I'm sorry, there's only one logical problem with that, and that is that they take drug companies. And that's always part of the argument. You spend all this money on advertising. If you weren't spending it on that, you could spend it on this. But they wouldn't be spending it on advertising if it wasn't making them more money.
Oh, absolutely.
So there's no more money to be gotten out of this for them. Now you'll keep some money in the consumers' pockets, but they wouldn't be spending it on advertising if they weren't getting a return on their investment.
Go back to the patients, or even to R&D.
Well, it would go back to
the
the patients because the patients wouldn't be spending the money to begin with.
Don.
I just think that genie's out of the bottle. I don't know how you put that back in. That's like telling people you can't, I just don't know how you regulate that in this environment where you go back and say the government says you can't see, you're not worthy to see these ads. Geez, the ads have more side effect language than they do what the benefit of the drugs for. So I don't understand that. I was taken back when it first started, but I don't know how you put that back in the bottle.
It's like asking me or Vinay not to use Twitter. It's impossible. It's like, I mean,
And some things are an addiction, so we need to see professional.
So it sounds like this debate, to remind us all, rising cost of cancer care, who is responsible? It sounds like we all are, right? So in 2 minutes here, I guess I'm just ad-libbing, 2 minutes each of you, start down here. Sounds like all of us are responsible, but what can we do? And I know it's a loaded question, it's what we've been debating. But in a few minutes here as we close.
are these my closing remarks?
Closing remarks.
I'm not running for office. You know, I mean, again, I'll go back to, I think the most important piece is that for all stakeholders, first of all, to acknowledge that there are problems and to stop pointing fingers at one particular sector or another. I think providers are responsible, hospitals are responsible, manufacturers are responsible. I mean, again, you go down the list, payers are responsible. I mean, if the hospital is charging for a pill of Tylenol $50 and the payer is paying for it, the hospital will be stupid not to charge $50. It would be a bad economic formula not to do so. So I think all of the stakeholders that are involved, and they need to sit together and make sure that patients are engaged with them and put patients in the center to try to resolve this issue. The second thing I would say is it's really essential for all of these stakeholders to agree on particular definitions. Value, we talk about value-based care, and it's an abused term at this point because, yes, what is value to one stakeholder versus another? So I agree with the motion of moving from volume-based care to value-based care. I think it's the right thing to do. But then let's sit together and define what value is and make sure that we all agree on what value is and move forward. And lastly, is we all need to have, again, measures that we look at to figure out if what we are doing today is actually successful. So everything might appear that this is the right thing to do, and that whatever we defined is acceptable. But unless we say, okay, we are going to reassess this, these are the outcome measures that we are going to look at in 3 years and decide if we were successful in our definition and what we did. And if we're not successful, we need to think about what to do alternatively.
Yeah, Congressman said it earlier, it's really complex. Geez, coming up with a pithy answer to something like this is really something. But I do like what he said about outcomes. I think about it from my own point of view as a patient. Forget about what I do for a living. What I would want to know if I was being treated, I want to know that whatever's being done is well researched. It has a probability of working, a good probability of working, and maybe even a high probability of working. My biggest beef with this healthcare system is actually the payers, by about 100 million miles compared to anything else in the system. And it goes to Medicare all the way through the commercial payers. They're really difficult to deal with. They're capricious. They're very opaque about how they make decisions, about what they will pay for, at what level they will pay for, what information they need. And then they'll change the rules and tell you, we were just kidding you. You really need to do this study. Then we'll think about paying you. There's a number of these things that go on around that you have to almost be, and I'm sure anybody in here has got something like that in their part of the world. In my part of the world, that happens a lot. And it creates huge disincentives for people to invest in innovation in healthcare. A lot of the venture capitalists who used to put a lot of money into healthcare, particularly the diagnostic side, have walked away from it totally. And part of it is because of Medicare is very difficult to work with. And even if they were good to work with, when you get, I hope nobody from Medicare is here because I'm trying to get a pricing thing done right now, but probably just killed it for my company. But commercial payers, each one, if you've seen one, you've seen one. They all have a different way of making a decision about the same thing. And that's why the NCCN guidelines and things like that are some unifying thing around medical policy. But it's a really complicated problem, and I do try to put myself in the patient's point of view, and that's why we try to make sure everybody who orders our tests gets it, no matter what we have to do to get them to get it. We'll pay for it if we have to.
So I think that as a charitable organization or as a patient advocacy organization, we're part of the problem if we're only providing dollars for research. And as much as a researcher all my life, I think that's critically important. All the cures in the world are meaningless if the patients can't access them. And so we need to be having conversations with all of our partners. And because we are somewhat of a neutral partner in this, we don't have IP wishes for any of the things that we're talking about. And because we interact with with the payers, with the pharmacy benefit managers, with pharmacy organizations, with a variety of players in the system, not to mention the docs and the FDA, we have the ability to have conversations with each of these, and we've been doing this, to say what are the areas where we know, in talking to patients, what's the most stressful for them. Where are there compromises that we can work on together with you, instead of saying, you're bad, this is bad. That doesn't get anyone anywhere. And I know it sounds incremental, but I think these conversations are starting to yield fruit, slowly but surely. And some of the out-of-pocket costs and having that come back to the patient, rather than it get caught in the middle of the system where it goes back to a payer, or it goes, from pharma to payer and payer to pharma, that the patient is part of that equation and gets some of the benefit of negotiations. I think that that's where we can have a voice and advocate for the patient, and we need to do that more than ever. And I think it may be at the compromise of doing a little less on the research side in order to be sure that that happens.
I guess I would say that, you often hear people talk about this space and how to reform it, and you hear dialogue about there's too much regulation or there's too little regulation, but I think we miss the fact that we have perverse regulation. We have regulations that contribute to, aid, and abet many of the problems we've discussed today. Just one example is the regulation that says Medicare has to pay for all approved cancer drugs and every drug recommended by the NCCN, and they can't negotiate the price. That's a regulation we built into the system that fuels this. So I think that we have to remember that the purpose of regulation is that, we're not going to change the goals of people. People will pursue usually what's in their best interest and what's easy and what they believe is right. We have to create the incentives around them so that the whole system does the right thing. And that is the purpose of policy. So I would look at many of these problems from a political lens. Once we define, as the congressman pointed out, that everyone needs health care, then it's an empirical question of, is single payer the best or some other method the best? Once you separate the political goal, the value, from how to implement it, you can start to test things and measure it and see if you're achieving what you want. But that process, sort of a rational policy process, seems fundamentally disconnected with our political system and our political cycle. And to break that, I suspect we have to break the core problem, which is the lobbying and the campaign finance, which is small pockets that are making a lot of money from the broken system, who lobby heavily to keep it broken, and a largely disinterested majority can never defeat a small vocal minority with a strong interest, at least in the current system. And that is a question for the congressman on how to solve that problem. Not me.
And that last point is one I make, the last point is one I make frequently. So you never underestimate the power of a very vocal minority. I would just summarize by saying three things. First of all, universal access. You've got to get everybody covered. Second of all, we have to pay for quality instead of quantity, and that gets into the regulatory, doing the regulations around that. But the third big point is we have to be honest with people about the difficulties here. And this was the biggest argument that I had with the Obama administration during the ACA debate, was I kept saying, you're saying things that really aren't true. I know they poll well, and I know you got to try to get this thing across the finish line, but we cannot fundamentally reform our healthcare system without there being some people who are going to be worse off. It's just impossible, all right? This whole notion, if you like your insurance, you can keep it. Well, no, you can't if we're really going to fundamentally shift the system. If you happen to be fortunate enough, even if you're a blue-collar worker, to work for a very large company that has a great insurance plan, then you're doing pretty well. But if you fall outside of that, we have to be honest with people about the debate. And towards that end, I'm going to close by talking about death, because this has been such a very positive conversation. I want to make sure I take that down a notch. And it was alluded to earlier, but this is one other thing that is uniquely problematic to America. We believe that we can conquer anything. And I think, we talk about how much money we spend on end-of-life care, and that's a huge problem, but we've never really asked, well, why? Because we are Americans. We don't lose. I mean, you walk into any elementary school in this country, and I guarantee you there's some poster somewhere that says, if you can dream it, you can do it. And being the person that I was watching, yeah, that's not actually true. I appreciate the sentiment, but when it comes to death, we don't accept it. You look at other cultures, they are vastly more accepting of it. Why do we spend so much money at the end of it? A lot of people say, well, you want to try to get that extra month. At the end of the day, it's because it is built into our DNA that if we do just a little bit more work, we're going to beat it. All right? And how many hundreds of billions of dollars do we spend on that misbegotten notion? And that is part of the honest conversation about healthcare we just don't have. Politicians, that's not what they're saying to their constituents. They're saying, I'm going to get you more coverage. It's going to cost less. There are tough, brutal choices in healthcare, and we refuse to address that. So we stumble around in the system that all you have to work in, trying to fight your way through it, through the ridiculous regulations that are made to please a given constituency in a given moment, and that was the missed opportunity. And I don't know. I mean, given the way people think of politicians, if President Obama had stood up and told people the truth about how we were going to reform healthcare, they probably would have rejected it overwhelmingly. We never would have gotten anything. I don't know. But until we have that conversation, we're not going to fix the system. We're going to be fighting, stumbling from battle to battle.
But also, I mean, part of it is what you just mentioned. We tend to, and Vinay and I agree on that 100%. Sometimes we just try to make the diagnosis with cancer as if it's just war, that you are, as a patient, just undergoing this unbelievable war, and if you don't take treatment, you're conceding. You lost a fight, and the other person won, and it's a huge fight, and all of these. And I think if we just shy away from these, we'll probably try to change the culture a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's a very,
I think just
very true thing.
These hyperboles and
it's not
these
just
definitions are just very. I think they do a disservice.
Yeah, it's not just cancer, by the way.
Right.
I mean, that's a mental battle with any healthcare, is the idea that if somehow you can't overcome this, you're a loser.
You lost the
Okay.
battle, or you're
Yeah.
not a warrior. Or,
And I think-
Right, you're not a warrior,
Right.
and I mean,
Right.
when it happens all over.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.